Hello, this is Angelia, and you're listening to or watching the podcast Why You Do What You Do, the podcast that deals with human development and psychology. And last time we were talking about Margaret Mead, who went and studied, the young girls in Samoa and, how they dealt with adolescence. And there's actually a really old movie called Moana, not the Disney one, that's about a young boy, growing up, and, him getting married at a young age. But, she was looking at their culture and things like that. Excuse me, uh, allergy itchies. And, she was also finding that there were changes happening, because of colonialism. And if any of you, have any Native American in you or know of the colonialism of the Americas, it was not an easy time because the culture that was coming in wanted them to get out of their way, basically. But they wanted them to assimilate. They didn't want them to be, whatever religion they were. They were considered pagans or whatever. They didn't want them to think the way they did about things or feel or wear their traditional clothing or do their traditional dances. So a lot of that was erased from their society by the settlers trying to make them more like them. So I imagine it was not an easy time. It was not an easy time for any of the Native Americans when the European colonials came over to colonize, discover America. Again, America was not discovered. There were millions of people here already. So, America was kind of taken rather forcefully, just a fact. So we're going to talk some more about Margaret Mead. Her life was all of, studying about people. As a young girl, she filled notebooks with observations about her siblings, and she became the scientist who traveled to distant lands and studied cultures very different from her own. Because the European culture and the Native America's cultures were very different, and that was part of the problem. The Europeans looked down on them as not being civilized, being savages, or what word you want to throw out there. But it was a culture that had been there for thousands of years. They had their own ways of doing things. So rather than, jump on board with let's change them, she wanted to study them and see, how they were different. Oh, I'm going to sneeze. Oh, excuse me. Mead's story underlines several important points about the study of human development. First, the study of people is not dry, abstract, or esoteric because there are facts that we can look at. In the days, of the 1920s and things, the West was romanticized, the Native American was romanticized, and that was not reality. And every store sold Indian merchandise, for the kids, dyed feathers, plastic, caps, so they could play cowboys and Indians, and it was just awful, really, because people were making money off these people who already had been pushed to the point of genocide. So, again, it's better to get to know a culture, immerse yourself in the culture, and understand the culture rather than believing stereotypes that you've heard from people who are not of that culture. It deals with the substance of real life. And the real life is what people do every day. What they do in the morning, how they eat their breakfast, what they wear, what they, do to celebrate their higher power, what things they do throughout the day, what they do at night before they go to bed. I mean, real life, the way people, believe and think and feel and, do things. Second, a cross-cultural perspective can reveal which patterns of behavior, if any, are universal and which are not. Because if, this English person does a certain thing or feels a certain way about things as this, person across the ocean, then that is something that's common to us as human beings. Most studies of human development have been done in Western developed societies using white, middle-class participants. And is that a fair slice of the world? Not really. No. Today, developmental scientists are increasingly conscious of the need to expand the research base, as Mead and her colleagues sought to do. And so, we're a little more understanding nowadays that, Hispanics might be different from Anglo-Saxon Americans. Native Americans might be different from both parties. Asian people are, might be different from all parties on certain things, but we all have certain things in common. Third, theory and research are two sides of the same coin. Because you have to have a theory in order to want to research, right? So you come up with a theory, and that's like any, got an itch here, any project I've ever done for, school. You have to come up with a theory, and then you have to do research to prove your theory or to show why your theory was wrong. So, when you're studying, especially people, sometimes you think a certain thing. I did a psychology project where I thought a certain thing and then I found out I was wrong. So, it's going to be an ongoing thing probably forever, the study of human development psychology, because as times change, feelings about things change. So it's probably going to be like the never-ending story. As Mead reflected on her own experiences and observed the behavior of others, she constantly formed tentative explanations to be tested by later research. Because, like children, when we are being scientists, if a child in a high chair drops his spoon off the chair and then the dog barks, in his mind, that's what made the dog bark, is that he dropped his spoon. So he'll keep knocking it off to see if the dog keeps barking. And then one time the dog might not bark, and then he's like, oh, well, now I'm not sure. So that's kind of how we are as scientists. We want to prove these things. Fourth, although the goal of science is to obtain verifiable knowledge through open-minded, impartial investigation, observations about human behavior are products of very human individuals whose inquiries and interpretations may be influenced by their own background, values, and experiences. And of course they are, because we are only human. And as we learned in some of these earlier studies, they might not have been the most humane, most unbiased, good studies ever conducted. And actually later on I'm going to learn about some even worse ones. So, oh, there's a fly. As Mead's daughter, Mary Catherine Bateson, herself an anthropologist, noted in response to methodological criticism of Mead's early work, I'm reading black letters on a brown background, so give me some patience here. In Samoa, a scientific observer is like a lens, which may introduce some distortion into what is observed. And we all do that because we have certain, things in us that color, what we see and experience. And it's hard to back off completely as a person and go only as scientific knowledge. Only the scientist, not, any part of you as a person. That's very hard to do. This is why scientists have others check their results. And that's a good thing to do. I've learned from people who've gone before me and did things before me. And when I was learning, I would ask for input, so I made sure I understood, because I knew, I was going to be dealing with people who had problems, and I didn't want to add to their problems. In striving for greater objectivity, investigators must scrutinize how they and their colleagues conduct their work, the assumptions on which it is based, and how they arrive at their conclusions. Oh my, staying flat. So you want your colleagues to look at how you've done, and when you're coming up, your professors will do that. Your whoever, if you're interning, will check that for you and make sure that things are how they should be. Again, sometimes we assume things, and that's incorrect. We find out later on that it wasn't right. My goodness. Oh. I was on the farm yesterday, so I got plenty of chlorophyll, which I'm allergic to. And how you came to the conclusion. What brought you to this conclusion? So as a scientist, it's always good to have, colleagues check your work. Make sure that you dotted your I's and crossed your T's, and that, this is not something that can be produced a different way, or that, like I said in the example of the toddler dropping the spoon, that the two actually didn't have anything to do with each other. It was just a coincidence. And in studying the results of research, it is important to keep these potential biases in mind. And that's why, in psychology, they talk a lot about theories. So-and-so's theory, so-and-so's theory. Because they could also explain things in another way. And so when that's the case, it becomes a theory. Because it might not pass muster for all things involved. Some of it might be good, sound facts, but then some of it might be subjective. So that's why you hear about a lot of theories. In the first part of this, we present major issues and theoretical perspectives that underlie much research in human development. In the remainder, we look at how researchers gather and assess information so that you will be better able to judge whether their conclusions rest on solid ground. After you have studied this chapter, you'll be able to, we're in the book here, so we're going to just skip all that stuff. We don't need to do that. We don't need to do any exercises. I'm not testing you on this. You're just listening. Basic theoretical issues. As we noted, the goals of the study of human development are to describe, explain, predict, and modify human behavior. And that's a hard thing to ask. Can you always predict human behavior? No, unfortunately, we cannot. We can describe it. A lot of times we can't explain it. Why did this person do what they did? I have no idea. You'd have to ask them, because, I don't even know. Modifying human behavior also is something that can be problematic. We have prisons, but that still doesn't work. Sometimes they just go in and learn how to be a better criminal. And then we have mental health facilities, but that doesn't always work. They might get with the program, and then when they get out into the real world again, they fall back on, where they were before. So these things don't always work out. In keeping with these goals, developmental scientists have come up with theories about why people develop as they do, why you do what you do. A theory is a set of logically related concepts or statements which seeks to describe and explain development and to predict what kinds of behavior might occur under certain conditions. And like I said, that's where we come up with a theory, because you don't really know what a person is going to do in any given situation. You don't know what you're going to do in any given situation until you're in that situation. Theories organize data, the information gathered by research, and are a rich source of hypotheses. I'm sure you know that word. That's something they taught you in science in school. Form a hypothesis. Tentative explanations or predictions that can be tested by future research. Goodness sakes. Research. Excuse my itchies today. Theories are dynamic. They change to incorporate new findings. Because someone's always coming up with something new. Someone is always working on somebody else's work to find out if they think, that's kind of an idea, but what I think is this. And so they're, it's like the Jurassic Park movie where he said, you stood on the shoulders of, giants and figured out how to do this, but you didn't ask, should you do this, somebody's always working on somebody else's work. Sometimes research supports a hypothesis and the theory on which it was based. But not always. At other times, as with Mead's findings challenging the inevitability of adolescent rebellion, scientists must modify their theories to account for unexpected data. So she found not the rebellious teenagers in Samoa that she thought she'd find. They had a pretty easy adjustment because their society was a lot more, easygoing, and there were, rituals and things. And so, they didn't have near the time, that the Western immigrant folks did. So, that she proved her hypothesis wrong because they just did it. Research findings often suggest additional questions and hypotheses to be examined and provide direction for dealing with practical issues. Like I said, somebody else is always working on somebody else's work, trying to expound it, trying to, see, is this true or is this other thing I maybe thought of true, The way theorists explain development depends in part on the way they view three basic issues. 1, the relative weight given to heredity and environment. That's always a big one, especially in psychology. Heredity versus environment. And it is a mix of both. But a lot of people, they want to argue, that this is the way you're programmed genetically. And, but we know if you're treated a certain way, if your environment is a certain way, that also affects you. So that's one that there's always arguments about. Whether people are active or passive in their own development, because that's a question. Can you change yourself? Of course you can. But some people feel like you, until you're a certain age, have no input in your development. It's strictly your parents, your family, your friends, the teachers at school. And I think to a certain extent you get a certain age, that's true. But once you get a certain age, like about, 9, 10 or whatever, you start to realize, yourself. You start to become a little bit more self-aware and realize you do have choices. You can choose to listen to this person or not. You can choose to respect what this person says or not. And 3, whether development is continuous or occurs in stages. And the answer to that is it actually kind of does both. There are stages, but you are moving in a continuous way. Now, having said that, you can also revert back to certain ways. So, it's more like, I heard someone talk about the spiral. It's more like that. Sometimes you're going a certain way, and something happens and it knocks you back. So that you fall back to, your fallback position. So someone who might have been gregarious and outgoing, and making this great life for themselves, and then, their house burnt down, or, they were attacked, or their family member that they loved the most was lost. And this might send them back to a previous stage in their life where they were more immature, more dependent, or whatever. We are continuously moving, but not always moving in the same direction all the time. Issue 1, which is more important, heredity or environment? Like I said, people argue about this one all the time. Which has more impact on development, heredity or environment? This issue has aroused intense debate. Theorists have differed in the relative importance they give to nature, the inborn traits and characteristics inherited from the biological parents, and nurture, environmental influences, both before and after birth, including influences of family, peers, schools, neighborhoods, society, and culture. Because, like I said, everything you experience affects you in some way. How much is inherited? How much is environmentally influenced? These questions matter. If parents believe that intelligence can be strongly influenced by experience, they may make special efforts to talk to and read to their children, and I did that, and offer them playthings that help them learn. Because I wanted my children to have the best start they could in life, and research shows that it does help. So I gave them that. If parents believe the intelligence is inborn and unchangeable, they may be less likely to make such efforts. And I think that's a shame, because basically you kind of give up on your kid before they've even started, Today, scientists have found ways to measure more precisely the roles of heredity and environment in the development of specific traits within a population. When we look at a particular person, however, research with regard to almost all characteristics pointing to a blend of inheritance and experience. Because the culture you're in, naturally, you're going to inherit the way you look, and the way you feel about things and believe about things. But as an individual, you are going to have different tastes. You're going to have different likes, So it's kind of, like I said, a tricky thing to kind of pinpoint which caused this, inheritance or environment. Thus, even though intelligence has a strong hereditary component, parental stimulation, education, peer influence, and other variables also affect it. And that's why sometimes parents get disturbed if your child suddenly starts doing what everybody else is doing, whereas then they had been, doing better and doing good things, and now suddenly they've reverted, and their friends are doing these things, and you're like, why? It's like the old saying, if everybody else jumped off the bridge, would you do it too? While there's still considerable dispute about the relative importance of nature and nurture, many contemporary theorists and researchers are more interested in finding ways to explain how they work together. And a little example they give here is golf champion Tiger Woods. Was his prowess inborn because his father, liked it and he trained, Tiger Woods? Or was, his experience of playing the game at such a young age what made him so good? And most people would say both. Development, active or passive? Are people active or passive in their own development? The controversy goes back to the 18th century. Oh yes, they had people studying, personality and emotions and, mental. They didn't necessarily always call it psychology then, but they had people studying back then. When the English philosopher John Locke held that a young child is a tabula rasa, or a blank slate, on which society writes. Because that's, one of the things they kind of believed is like, you're born, you're nothing, you're a blank slate, you're like a computer, you need to be programmed. And a lot of people believe that, but other people believe you start out with a certain amount of information, then you add to that. In contrast, the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau believed that children are born noble savages who would develop according to their own positive natural tendencies unless corrupted by a repressive society. We now know that both views are too simplistic. Children have their own internal drives and needs, as well as hereditary endowments that influence development. But children also are social animals who cannot achieve optimal development in isolation, because we learn from watching others and then doing ourselves. So if you never watched how another person, zipped up their coat, you might not have learned how to do that. If you never watched how a certain person wrote, you might not learn to make that loop a certain way. If you never watched how a certain person, opened a milk carton when you were having trouble with it, you might not have learned how to do that. We don't learn in a bubble of isolation. We learn from watching others. The debate over Locke's and Rousseau's philosophies led to two contrasting models or images of development: mechanistic and organismic. That's a weird word. I would say organistic, but they called it organismic. It's too close to another word. Locke's view was the forerunner of the mechanistic model of development. In this model, people are like machines that react to environmental input. Like I said earlier, when you're born, you got something going on, but you need more input, like poor little Johnny Five and Short Circuit. If we know enough about how the human machine is put together and about the internal and external forces acting on it, we can predict what the person will do within reason. Mechanistic research seeks to identify and isolate the factors that make people behave or react as they do. For example, in seeking to explain why some college students drink too much, a mechanistic theorist might look for environmental influences such as advertising and whether the person's friends drink to excess. Unfortunately, both feed into that. If your friends are doing it, you're more likely to do it too. Rousseau was the precursor of the organismic model of development. The model sees people as active, growing organisms that set their own development in motion. And to an extent, that's also true. They initiate events. They do not just react. Because we seek out people to play with. We seek out things that interest us. So we do participate in our own development. The impetus for change is internal. And usually it's curiosity or wanting to, have a friend, wanting to fit in, whatever it might be. Environmental influences do not cause development, though they can speed or slow it. Like I said, children in an abusive or neglectful environment, they do not develop as fast as people in a loving, nurturing environment. So that's just unfortunately something that is a reality for some people. Human behavior is an organic whole. It cannot be predicted by breaking it down into simple responses to environmental stimulation, as the mechanistic model suggests. And that's, a fact there, that everyone's going to respond differently because everyone has a different experience. Again, with your experience is everything that's ever happened to you, everything you've ever, seen, heard, smelled, tasted, touched, everything you've thought is going to be different from everyone. Even, oh my gosh, the word escapes me. Identical twins. Goodness sakes. Yeah, strokes are fun. Don't have one. I don't recommend it. But even identical twins differ in their experiences. So, it just is going to affect you, and everyone's going to have a different response, and so you can't predict that accurately. An organismic theorist, in studying why some students drink too much, would be likely to look at what kinds of situations they chose to participate in and with whom. And I can tell you, that's a big thing right there. What situations you find yourself in. Because you can find yourself in good situations, you can find yourself in unfortunate situations. And what you've learned so far to that point is only what you have to go on to navigate through that situation. So, if you find yourself in that situation and you're someone who's, given to peer pressure, you want to fit in, you're more likely to do this thing that these other people are doing. Do they choose friends who like to party or who are more studious? I had only a few friends who liked to party. I liked more studious people because we had more in common. We watched a lot of the same, TV, read a lot of the same books, played a lot of the same games. So, I had a few friends who was out partying a lot, and sometimes I would, go to parties or whatever and have fun. But in general, I was more towards the intellectual part than I was towards party person. And some people, didn't know that about me and assumed things, but they were wrong. Issue 3 is development continuous or does it occur in stages? The mechanistic and organismic models also differ on the third issue. Is development continuous or does it occur in stages? And that's where we're going to stop right here. And next time we're going to talk about that. So that's all for now. Until next time. Hopefully this has helped you think about or figure out a little more about why you do what you do.